Get started. It's so exciting and lovely to see such a wonderful group together today. My name is Elizabeth Steglish, and I co-direct the Immigration Clinic together with Denise Gilman, and we are very appreciative of our partners at the Justice Center for pulling this panel together and making this remembrance and reflection of such an important moment in history during Hispanic Heritage Month possible. So I want to introduce our stellar panelists. Ernesto Munoz is one of the Bowie High School student claimants, and we're so lovely that he can join us, having crossed campus from the School of Education. He received his master's in education from Texas State and now oversees elementary school development curriculum as a senior project manager here at a project out of the college, the School of Education. He's been in the education field for 20 years. Clearly his time at Bowie impressed him and inspired him to continue giving forward and educating so many of our Texas youth. Starting out as a bilingual elementary teacher and was a principal for a time before shifting into policy and curriculum development. So we're so thrilled to have him with us. Barbara Hines, many of you will know, is the founding director of the Immigration Clinic, starting in 1999 here. She continued to teach in the Immigration Clinic as well as other immigration areas, courses at the law school until 2014. She received the Massey Award for teaching, the only clinical professor to do so yet. And her critical role in Texas civil rights education, Texas civil rights litigation in Texas really cannot be overstated. From 1991 until 1994, so during this litigation, she was the first co-director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, with the statewide immigration litigation and advocacy organization. She continued in that advocacy, using litigation as a tool to challenge family detention and the immigration practice, leading to the cessation of family detention at the nearby Hutto Detention Center, and ultimately encouraging a policy of stepping away from family detention in the immigration space, period. She received a BA here from Lilas at UT, attended UT Law, and received her degree from Northeastern University. And we're also very excited to have our 2022 alum, Lulu Ortiz, come back to facilitate and moderate this conversation. After graduating, Lulu clerked for Judge Pittman here in town at the Federal District Court. She now serves as staff attorney with Casa Marianella, a local migrant shelter. And while in law school, she participated in the Supreme Court Clinic, both as first and advanced student. And she served on the Justice Center Student Advisory Board, was a pro bono scholar, was on Texas Law Review and education chair for CHILSA, and clerked during her summers with Legal Aid Society of New York and the National ACLU Immigrant Rights Project. She's originally from El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and has experience working there with immigrant rights organizations prior to coming to law school. So I will pass it along to them. Please hold questions. We will have time for Q&A at the end. And we don't have a mic, so keep background noise to a minimum so we can hear our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. I know it's sort of weird, so one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is that we got lucky enough to have two people who were right there at the heart of this lawsuit, at the heart of the action. But first of all, I want to talk to you a little bit about what right there actually means, because when we were preparing for this conversation, we talked about how for all of us, having experienced a couple of parts of the Mexican-American border, the US-Mexico border at El Paso feels very different. Because I think a lot of us who have experienced other parts of the US-Mexico border are used to areas where there might be a lot of rural development, and then you hit the border, there might be a city, then a lot of nothing, or maybe a national park, and then there is the Mexican town or city. But El Paso, to me, feels different. So this is a map of El Paso. I'm just gonna stand up so it's easier to point out a couple of things. This is a map of part of Juarez and part of El Paso, and the pins that you see here are 3 of the ports of entry. There's a 4th on the New Mexico side. And I want us to zoom in on the officially named International Port of America's Bridge, and locally known as the Puente Libre, because it's the toll-free one. And as you see, like, look at all the stores, look at all that development. It is right there. Right, and I want us to zoom in a little bit more and highlight a couple of things so that you really understand what I mean by right there, right? This is the Rio Grande, that is the official border. That's the port of entry, and that's the zoo. And that is the Coliseum, which also doubles as a skating ring. That is University Medical Center, which was known as Thomason Hospital. I happen to be born there. That is the Ciudad Juarez University Social Science School. That is those sorts of buildings for their sports department. That is a Mexican federal park in Chamizal, and that is the equivalent portion in the United States side. And all of this is within a 2, maybe 3 mile radius of the port of entry. And in case you haven't noticed the little pin over there and you don't know what the punchline is, that is Bowie High School. That's the border. This is less than a mile from the port of entry, and that is Bowie High School. How close to the border is Bowie High School? It's close. It's super close. You can see this driving from Mexico. You can see this from the highway as you head towards the park, the equivalent of maybe Zilko Park here. You can see it as you head to one of the ports of entry, as you head to school, as you head to work. It's right there. How close? That is a random parking lot, a screenshot that I took a couple of days ago, and that is the infamous border wall. I just want you to understand how close it is and why the things that we are about to talk about were happening. And I think, Ernesto, that's where I want us to get started, because you were a student at Bowie, at La Bowie. So talk to us a little bit about what was happening.
Sure. And if you go back to one of the other pictures, I'll so here's Bowie High School. I used to live right off of Rivera Street, which is right around here. So obviously I would walk to school whenever possible. But again, we're very close to the International Bridge and the crossing. And yeah, I was born and raised in El Paso, and I lived there most of my life. I didn't move to Austin until after high school. But you know, and I guess it's not pictured up here, but the middle school is also just a little bit further down the road, also along the border. So you know, my entire childhood, my entire life was spent living in that neighborhood, living in that area. And the you know, the Border Patrol was just a constant presence in our lives and in our community. And you know, it almost became like, you know, part of the way of life. Everybody, you know, knew of the Border Patrol. Everybody was aware that the Border Patrol was always monitoring us, always around us. So we adapted, I guess you could say, to having them in our community. And over the years, I think people just, you know, gave in and accepted mistreatment from Border Patrol agents and abuse of power and those kinds of things. So yeah, is that?
No, that's great. And before we get to Barbara and how we got involved, what do you think made a difference? When did things start rolling and change seemed necessary?
So when I started high school, which was in 1992, which was a while back, I attended Bowie High School, and I guess it's important to remember and point out that schools were a little bit different back then. This was, before 9/11, before school security started, getting a little bit tighter. So we had open doors, and access. Everybody had access to the campus. So I was a student at Bowie High School, and there would be times when we would be sitting in class, just like now, and we would, hear people running down the hall, followed by Border Patrol agents, apprehending people at the end of the hall and dragging them out of school. If students happen to be out, getting a drink of water or going to the restroom, and just happen to be out there at that time, they would also get, apprehended and taken in and questioned and so on. We had an organization there at the school. It was called MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. And slowly we started having more and more conversations about these things that were happening on our campus and that were happening to us. I think one of the triggering incidents was one of our social studies teachers, Juan Coronado. He was kind of joking with a student because the student was late to class, and he was habitually late to class. And one of those times he's like, why are you late again? Why are you late to my class? And he said, oh, I was stopped by the Border Patrol. And he said, nice try, and other students started saying, no, he's telling the truth. And he started asking, have any other students experienced these kind of things from the Border Patrol? And hands started going up around the room. And beyond that classroom, right, more and more students started talking about these incidents and these these kinds of things. So slowly we started gaining a little bit more momentum. And then there was another incident that I think Barbara could probably talk a little bit more about, that kind of helped get things going a little bit further.
And of course, these stories eventually become a lawsuit. And as we get to that part of the story, Barbara, if you want to tell us how you got involved.
Sure. And just to sort of frame this whole thing, I think, to think about it looking back, and it's just been such a wonderful experience, because those of you who are lawyers in the room, you don't generally get to sit up here 30 years later with one of your plaintiffs. And so it's just really such a wonderful and emotional experience for me. I just want to say that, because you generally wonder what happened to people after you have these lawsuits. So thank you, Ernesto, for doing this with me. So, it was really a different time and a different enforcement model. So when we're talking about El Paso, one thing I want to say, and for those of you of a different generation, I know this is really hard to imagine. The idea was, what the Border Patrol did is that they let people cross the border and they watched them. They had something called line patrol with binoculars, and they let people come across the border. If you're from El Paso from that time, there are some people in this room that may remember the inner tubing. You could come across for $1 on the inner tubes, and then the Border Patrol would have high-speed chases through the neighborhoods and through Bowie. This was way before up on the levee pushing people into the desert. So that's one reason why Bowie, so close to the border, was having the Border Patrol running rampant on the campuses. Really very different time, and a fence with a bunch of holes in it. So that's one thing. And, also a very different time with very receptive courts, and so when I look back 30 years later, we had, we did not have the same Fifth Circuit, and we had very different judges at the time as well. So, with the student, so we had just gotten money from the Ford Foundation to start a litigation organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which is a national organization. And we were starting the Texas branch out of San Antonio. And unlike some impact litigation outfits where you're like, this is the case I want to do, and now I'm going to go look for plaintiffs. Really, what was unique about this is that the students found us. We didn't really find the students. We knew that Border Patrol abuse in Texas, just like today, was a priority, but really we were contacted by Texas rural legal aid and the Border Rights Coalition, which was an organization of advocates out in El Paso at that time that had begun to work with Mecha and with Juan Cyber Coronado out of Bowie. And we were asked to come out there and begin to talk to students. One thing that was important, and I might add, is that the students, and you may remember this, had begun to complain, and they had a very vocal principal, Paul Strelson, who was like, basta ya. And he was like from New York and very outspoken. He was also the announcer for Miners baseball out there. And he had a radio, and he was like, this is enough. And Mr. Musegades, the head of the INS, just blew off the students. And this comes back later, sort of the empowerment of the students I'm going to talk about in a second, about what happened to Musegades. So basically, we went out there asked to sort of start doing this litigation. And what I want to emphasize, what Ernesto said, is it was incredible how pervasive this was. Initially, some students were very brave and they were willing to tell us the stories. Other students said, no, my parents are too afraid. I have undocumented people in my family. But I think what I learned from this lawsuit was there were strength in numbers. And as some students started coming forward, students sort of banded together, and it was just amazing how many stories we got. The impetus for this lawsuit, besides the bravery of the students, was that Ben Murillo, the named plaintiff in this case, was the high school football coach. And for those of us that have spent time in Texas, who would your dream plaintiff be? And he was driving with the two of the junior varsity players, and he was pulled over, and the Border Patrol pulled a gun to his head and pulled him out of the car. In depositions, the Border Patrol claimed that this never happened. We had 4 witnesses, and I took their deposition, and they're like, this incident never happened. And so he was our named plaintiff. We went to court. So we had him, we had all of the students. We had a student, David Renteria, who had been, who was walking, he was legally blind. He was walking home from his graduation practice. And one thing, remember, and you can talk more about this, that you all had learned was to exercise their constitutional rights and to not answer questions, and to say, I'm an American citizen, I'm not answering any other questions. And they pushed him against the wall. They ripped up his graduation certificate. They called the police and they said, this guy thinks he's a lawyer. He thinks he's not going to answer the questions. We filed the lawsuit in front of Judge Bunton, who 10 years before had issued another injunction against the Border Patrol in a restaurant raid. We got a preliminary and a permanent injunction, and I know I'm going over my time, right? So I should probably stop. I just want to tell you briefly then, we got a fabulous settlement. And I think this once again is probably what we might not be able to get nowadays, but we got a permanent injunction enjoining stops based on Hispanic or imputed Hispanic appearance. We forced the Border Patrol to implement a complaint system. Oh, yeah. Are you moving these along for me? Oh, great, thank you. A complaint system that the Border Patrol had to give out to anybody that complained. They had to have a 1-800 number system. they had to recognize and acknowledge a complaint system. They had to give out statistics and report to us every quarter of the statistics. It's one of the things that students complained about is all this stuff happened and there was no recourse ever. So we had a very complex complaint system. They had to identify themselves and give out cards if they were stopped, because otherwise, how could you know who the person was that was pushing you up against the wall or pointing the gun to your head? One of my favorites was that they were forced to read, they had to read the injunctions because Musegades got up in front of Judge Bunton, who had issued the injunction 10 years ago, and said he had never heard of the decision. And Judge Bunton did not like that. So part of the settlement was that every Border Patrol agent had to sign that they had read both of them. They had to do training, and we were allowed to prepare a video for training and participate in the trainings. And we also got a monetary FTCA damages for unnamed plaintiffs. And most importantly, Mr. Musegades took a early retirement. So I think it was really a great victory at that time for this group of brave plaintiffs.
Of course. Thank you, Barbara. I have so many questions. I'm gonna put a pin on some of the things that you mentioned of it being a particularly receptive court, because I want to come back a little bit to the students, right? Y'all have mentioned there were so many stories that the students banded together. So what then that they were learning about their rights, right? What was that process like?
So it was there was definitely a lot of fear, and you know, a lot of us took these stories and you know, these incidents back to our families and talked to our parents. I was just talking to my parents a couple of days ago, you know, telling them about this event and talking to them about it. And, you know, both of my parents said, oh yeah, we had incidents with the Border Patrol as well, but we never said anything, and we never talked to you and your siblings about it, because we didn't want you to worry or to have this fear. So, you know, I guess when we started having those conversations about, you know, we want to do something about it, we learned that we have rights and we want to you know, stand up and do something about it. There was some hesitation and some concern that it would bring additional consequences or repercussions that we, you know, that we didn't want. My parents were both born in Mexico. At the time, they were considered resident aliens. They had, you know, a resident visa, but there was always that fear of, if I say something, they could revoke my permission and send me back to Mexico or send me, you know, out of this country. So it was always, you know, just that fear of don't say anything because you don't want to make things worse.
Of course. And one of the consequences that did happen from the lawsuit was there was a lot of publicity, right? How was that on purpose? Did that just happen organically?
I mean, there was some publicity and some attention at the time, but again, I think, you know, it was a different time, and this was before the internet and before social media. So, you know, a lot of the incidents would blow up locally, and there would be a lot of attention. It was on the newspapers, and I think Good Morning America came down to our campus and visited El Paso and did a segment on it. I think Al Gore also came down at one point. And you know, and then everything just kind of fizzled, you know, and I was telling Barbara that I reached out to some of my classmates, and they had forgotten all about this incident. And I guess this past summer, I found out that Barbara was part of the university, and I had started working here at the university, and I reached out, and we had a lovely lunch and we reconnected and we started talking about this story a little bit more. But it is heartbreaking in a way to learn that even though we had a victory, very little has changed, and in many ways we've gone backwards a little bit more. Even 30 years later. But anyway.
Of course, and I think it's especially heartbreaking because of what Barbara has mentioned, because what both of you have mentioned, which is we are living in a completely different time. Barbara, both here and in some of our previous conversations, you said that the context was just completely different. So do you think that you would reach, the same decisions or the same results today?
Well, the courts are very different, and Judge Bunton is no longer here. And so probably not. I'm sorry to say that. I know for law students, I'm always trying to say something more optimistic. So I'm going to say that you all will live to see a different court system. I won't, but you will. And so I think you shouldn't give up hope, and there will be a time when you'll be able to achieve the same kind of results. I think the law has changed. I was just trying to think, like, could we have gotten a permanent injunction? Would there have been pushback in terms of our class certification? I mean, all the things that the courts have done to try to stop you from even moving forward. But what I would like to take away is I do think there is power in community organizing and students getting together and saying no. And I think maybe there would be, you have to use different strategies. We didn't have social media then, and we didn't really have a press strategy. I think sort of the press and how to use, they got really bad press, but it was kind of organic. It wasn't like we sat down. I think nowadays you as lawyers or organizers think about what your press and community organizing strategy is in a way that we didn't. And so in that sense, maybe you would have a different result in a different way. I mean, I will say, sadly, one of the unintended consequences of this was they were planning to do this anyway. So I'm not ever willing to say that we're responsible for this. But there was a change in Border Patrol enforcement, which is the students were saying, get out of our campus and get up on the levee. You can do enforcement in a different way. And so Musegades left. The new Border Patrol chief, Sylvester Reyes, who then became the U.S. rep, then began to start enforcing up on the levee, which pushed people farther out of town. And, then, began to do enforcement on the levee, beginning to the militarization and the, more dangerous Border Patrol enforcement strategies. So, and that's where we are kind of today. So that's a very long answer to no, we probably would not have had the success that we had in Bowie today.
Of course, and just to give a little bit more context, of course, it was a different time, it was a different political context. We were at the beginning of the Clinton administration. It was in El Paso where people were, particularly aware of the reality of the border, with the particular judge that had already shown that was willing to stand up against Border Patrol. And so it's, of course, that's part of the context, but I think that's also important for anyone here who's training to be a lawyer, of thinking all of those are factors that also go into preparing your legal strategy. Of course, I could fill the time with all my questions, but I want to make sure that there's some space for people to ask questions. So if we want to, I don't know if anyone has questions. I can just keep going, but I'm gonna, yeah, all right. So let's keep talking a little bit about today, because you've mentioned, of course, know that you are in the education space, and we assume, but I want to hear from you, right? Was this experience part of what led you there?
So yes, I guess the short answer to that is yes. When I graduated high school, I really didn't have an idea of what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I moved to Austin shortly after graduating, and I guess moving to Austin and leaving El Paso was a shock to me because all of a sudden I am really a minority. And I studied different things. I think at one point I was studying civil engineering, and then I switched over to psychology and then social work, and eventually I landed in education. But it was a former teacher from high school that I had a conversation with him, and we talked about what I was doing, and he suggested, well, have you thought about education? Have you thought about being a teacher? He said that I could reach a lot of students that way, and a lot of people that way, and make a difference in a lot of people's lives. And that kind of put me on that path. As a bilingual teacher, my first job was working in a Title I school, and working with students from low socioeconomic backgrounds and minorities, and a lot of my work was geared towards advocacy as well, and doing everything that I could to give these students equal opportunities. And then that kind of led to me working with students with disabilities, and being an autism specialist, and again, always kind of focusing on that most vulnerable population. And during that time of working with children, I've just been fascinated by their way of seeing things. And now I'm a parent, and I was sharing with Barbara that in July we took a trip to New York, and my son is 9 years old, and he pointed out that every time we went through security, I was pulled aside for random additional screening. And he said, "Is it because you're brown?" Sorry. And I'm like, if he is 9 years old and he can see this, like, something's wrong with us, and we need to do something about it. So, a lot of the work that I continue to do is still focused on that, on bringing that equity, and bringing that, embracing that diversity, and just creating equal opportunities for everybody. Yeah.
And I keep coming back to this idea of things feel different, right? You've also been an educator in this time where there's been a rollback of a lot of the support that there was for students of all sorts of diversity, both racial, in terms of abilities and disabilities, and of course in the age of social media and the rise of social media. Right? Have you, sorry, one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is, of course, because what happened at Bowie was very unique. People were coming together. It was a smaller school at the time. People knew each other and started sharing the stories. How do you think all of these changes have changed the playing field?
I don't know. I think maybe people are more willing to take risks, and hopefully we learned from our experience that we can do something about it, and there is that hope, and that we can change things. So I think I guess back then, if we made a claim that something happened, we didn't have our phones that we could pull out and report it, right? So where is that evidence? And it was always our word against somebody else's. And it was usually our word against somebody with a badge and a gun, and who are you going to believe? And, now with technology and all kinds of things, I think it's easy to assume that you're always being reported. And there's always going to be somebody that is going to have that evidence that is going to support your story.
Thank you. And Barbara, I want to talk to you a little bit about legal strategy, if you will, because we've talked a little about how the publicity came in, how you started selecting clients. What were you looking for when you were selecting people? And is there anything, again, take into account that this might be a losing case if you had taken it today, is there anything different you would do in strategy given the playing field today?
Well, we were looking for the high school football coach to start with. No, we were looking for, first of all, I think we were looking for students that were willing to come forward. Because as I said, a lot of the students weren't willing to come forward. We were looking for students that had the strongest cases. And so we kind of had people kind of in descending order. And that's not to say that constant fear and harassment and having your backpack opened constantly, was not terrible. But we know, obviously, when you're a litigator, you're taking your strongest facts first and laying them out and then going in descending order. So that was one way that we picked people. Having a gun pulled out against you was our strongest. That was the first case. Then came David, the person who said, I'm an American citizen and I'm exercising my constitutional right not to answer your questions. And they pushed him up against the wall and said, este buoy lawyer, thinks he's not going to answer the questions. And one thing I wanted to say is that Judge Bunton was so kind to these students. First of all, you may remember this, but most of them didn't own a suit. And so when you go into the federal courtroom, there's like these suits. So the students were wearing suits that were kind of big for them. And then David told this story, just for a little levity. David told this story where they were saying that he was the este buoy lawyer. And so every time another student got up to testify, who was really nervous, Judge Bunton would say, well, are you another one of those buoy lawyers? And everybody would laugh. He really just did a lot, I think. Maybe, I don't think you testified, but to try to make people at ease. So that's kind of how we picked students. There were a few, we didn't pick anyone who was undocumented. There were clearly undocumented students at Bowie, but as a litigator, you don't want to do that. I think we dismissed someone who had some criminal, maybe problems. We didn't want that person. So, just the tactical decisions as a lawyer that you're making. So that's how we kind of pick people. I would probably make the same decisions today. I would make the same strategy decisions that lawyers make, and that is to try to find a district, which probably still is maybe El Paso, where you might still find what we would consider sympathetic courts, the same strategies of finding a related case. So basically, you can file, if you can find a case that is related. We picked Judge Bunton because we filed this connected to the Mendoza case. So Mendoza was the case that he had issued the preliminary injunction in 10 years before. But that was prohibiting raids in certain restaurants in El Paso. And it was not a class action. But we filed it saying it was a related case. So that's another legal strategy, if it's somehow connected. So, those are the same kind of legal strategies I would think about today. And then, the strategies people are trying to think about is, can you make it a national thing so that you can sue in Washington, D.C.? Those kinds of things. And then I think, some people today are filing lawsuits, not because they can win, but because they think there's a policy strategy or a media strategy or some other reason.
Of course. And you had mentioned earlier about the power of organizing. I think something that is clear from the story and even from what all of you are hearing is the power of storytelling, right? I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you can see in the other picture, Barbara was talking about our clothing. But well, that's me in the background, but yeah, that's me with the I guess in the middle there in the background.
This is the person who lost his job. Who
Yes,
took early
that's
retirement.
Musegades. But anyway, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this picture, but I'm the guy in the back there with his jacket over my shoulder. And right now that Barbara was talking about this, I remember that the clothes that I wore that day were clothes that I got. I was dating a girl that her mom worked at Dillard's or somewhere like that. And they were doing a spring show or something, and they needed people to model the spring line. So my girlfriend talked me into doing this, and one of the perks was that I got to keep the clothes, and that's the clothes that I wore. My modeling career didn't take off. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of funny.
These are the things that lawyers never know. Can you go back to the settlement, the picture, Maria Jimenez? So this is when we were signing the final settlement, and this is at Bowie. And I don't know whether I think it's supposed that we took it there because the kids were in school. And I guess I want to, for those of you, this person was also a very key person in a statewide organizer, Maria Jimenez, and she was, for those of you, very few people in this room probably remember her, but she really was the founder of a statewide border abuse project, and she had come to El Paso to organize. She's no longer with us, but that is Maria Jimenez, and she was a key person in this lawsuit as well. But that is one of the plaintiffs signing the settlement agreement.
So you have a picture of the Texas Observer doing publicity. What is the local El Paso establishment? How did they respond?
So I remember after that case and after that day, there was almost like a parade, I guess, like an impromptu parade that happened where a lot of us walked from the courthouse back to Bowie High School. They were, fairly close. And that picture where we're all walking is from one of the news stations that, went ahead and arrived at Bowie and filmed us as we were walking back to the campus. But, I guess shortly after that, there was like again, a lot of attention and a lot of publicity. Our then principal, Paul Strells, and he had a voice for radio. I mean, he had a radio show, and he was the announcer at the baseball games. So he was very vocal and very loud about this story. So that brought in a lot of attention from media and capturing the story and trying to do something about it. And then it just kind of fizzled, very quickly. There was a lot of attention, and then very quickly it just kind of dissipated. I believe it was called Operation Pull the Line, was initiated almost immediately after. And for us, it was great that the Border Patrol was no longer on our campus, but they were still visible from our campus. I guess we were a little bit more at ease of not needing to look over our shoulder all the time or have that fear of getting stopped and searched and those kinds of things.
Because our settlement was that they could not stop people without reasonable suspicion, and that could not be based on
You match the description.
Yeah.
You match the description
That's the
of
description within the Bowie High School district. So it was the geographic district, so it was a larger boundary than just the school. So, and that was a 5-year period where basically, I think there was less patrolling. You can tell me you live in that neighborhood, at least for a period of 5 years. They had to go make their unlawful arrests in some other part, probably of El Paso. And we monitored this for 5 years. So we did look at their reports and stuff like this for a 5-year period.
Of course,
There's two.
we have another question over here and another one over there. Let's start over here. In the back.
Were there any students that wanted to put a more, or was there any?
No, I don't think so.
No, I think basically there was no disagreement, I think, over the settlement provisions. Our monetary settlement was confidential. I think once money comes in, it becomes trickier. About when you get, and I learned some things. Well, I'll tell you, yes, this is what I learned from this, for those of you that are gonna be lawyers, that if you're representing a group of people, you need to have really clear discussions from the outset. There's some lawyers here that did more of these lawsuits than me, really clear from the outset about if you get a pot of money, how to divide it up. And that's what I learned from that lawsuit, is like, how do you divide this up if you're representing a group of people? And I would say, from a sort of ethics and from a litigation standpoint, and I had never done that before, to have some real clear delineations about how that would happen in the future.
We got another question over here.
It's obvious that the Border Patrol was oblivious to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which had been passed in 1990 and applied to the federal government, and the Rehab Act, which had been in effect for decades. Was there any piece of the litigation that involved the blind student?
No, I should have consulted you.
Where were you 30 years ago?
No, but I should, no, that would have been good. No, we didn't really think about that, but thank you. If we file it again.
We have a question over here.
Okay.
Let's go here and then.
Okay, thanks for doing this. By the way. In regards to the 5 years of monitoring of their activity, did you glean any insight into their behavior through that, like anything useful, or was it just?
No, I mean, what we had claimed before is that they were inflating their statistics. One of the things, I don't know if you remember this, one of the justifications because Musegades had come to the campus, you all had asked for a meeting with Metro students, had asked for a meeting. Were you at that meeting?
Yes.
So, and then he just kind of blew you off, right? And said that, actually the campus was safer because he was on the campus. And so, so they claimed that they had to be there. And so we were arguing that they were inflating their statistics. And we actually had an ex-Border Patrol guy who was our expert who said that these were inflated statistics. So, I think the statistics were sort of disappointing because a lot of people didn't end up filing lots of complaints. And so really, we thought that there was going to be this was going to be tons of complaining. Now, maybe they behaved better, but we were able to say, what we were really doing was we said, you're not complying with X or Y. And we were able to push them on how they were supposed to be implementing their complaint procedure. But as I remember feeling like, wow, this didn't really get us to I think what we did more was a disincentive for bad behavior during that 5-year period. And in that sense, I think it was a good thing.
Thank you. Had a question over here.
I was hoping to know a little more specifically from the student perspective, how you all came to be in contact with Barbara and represented by her. Was it through the organizing?
So it was through just discussions with Mecha, and again, we had tried to contact the border patrol chief and have a discussion and have a conversation with him. And we weren't going to get anywhere with that. And I don't know, I guess it was Susan Kern with the Border Rights Coalition that somehow learned about this case or learned about these incidents and just kind of started putting things together on the other side, and then we all came together in the middle.
You know how I remember this is that Juan, 30 years later, Juan Cyber Coronado invited the Border Rights Coalition in to tell you, to sort of train you all and tell you what to do when the Border Patrol stopped you. Because what I remember, and maybe, is that you all learned to say, I'm an American citizen and I don't, and I'm going to walk away, or am I under arrest? I'm not answering any more questions. And so I think the Border Rights Coalition came in, and that's how everybody learned to walk away, right? Didn't you do some practice or
some role playing,
Maybe even, do you
to
remember
just
that?
very, very faintly, but I do remember that we did have meetings with organizations, and I think it was after David Renteria experienced the I guess the beating from the Border Patrol, that he talked to his counselor, his guidance counselor at the time, his academic counselor at the time, and she was an El Paso native, and as the counselor of the school, she also had experiences with the Border Patrol as a child growing up in that area, and now as an employee of the school and an adult still living in that area. So and she encouraged David to seek legal representation, and then I think that's when the Border Rights Coalition came in and coached us and helped us to start using that language and saying, I'm going to use my right to remain silent. I don't have to answer your questions, because when we were stopped, they would ask us for identification. And it's funny because I found my middle school ID, but our high school ID was very similar to this, and this is the only identification that we had. I mean, we were a bunch of kids, right? And we would present this to the Border Patrol agents, and they would, take it and say, like, this is garbage. Like, anybody can, this is not an ID, and throw it away or throw it out. And there was no way for us to prove that we were American citizens. So anyway, I guess after meeting with the Border Rights Coalition and doing some role play, some of us got a little bit more courage to stand up and say, I don't have to answer your questions. If you're going to place me under arrest, place me under arrest, and then I'll call a lawyer or call somebody. But otherwise, I don't have to answer your questions.
But basically, I got a call from a lawyer that I knew at Texas Rural Legal Aid, Mark Schneider, who was a lawyer out there.
Thank you. I saw a question over here. So let's start here. We have one, two, three. Is there anyone else I'm missing? All right, let's start here.
Yeah, so I think at least some of the provisions in the settlement expired after 5 years. Did you do any follow-up or notice changes once those provisions expired? Was there backsliding some of the progress lapsed?
I was sort of I wasn't at the lawyers committee anymore, and we were really moving on to other things. There probably was,
Yeah, and I left El Paso, 3 years later. So
probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope, they weren't patrolling on the campus anymore. I guess in that sense, they weren't up on the campuses, but by then they had really changed their, Border Patrol enforcement mechanisms. And they were like up, really trying to, seal off the border.
And of course, a couple of years
Yeah,
later,
you live there, what do you think?
no, I mean, they're still very much present.
Yeah.
At this point, it's not just the border patrol harassing people at the schools, they recruit at the schools. Right, there's a big border patrol guy at the baseball games. They appear on the Thanksgiving parade. It's sort of wild. So I don't know, when you see the border patrol guy at the Chihuahuas games, I'm pretty sure we have that flipped. I see I had a question over here and then another one over here. Let's start here.
Yeah, actually, my question was kind of related to that. I'm also on board meeting from the beginning. And I think part of like what happens too is like it took me a while to realize like the experience of how you grow up there and like having like 4 or 5 different law enforcement agencies on you at any other time. It's not like the typical experience. So given like the normalization, the ways in which people get like desensitized and also like the time restrictions, right? Like this case, like what would you all share as like flags or like right concerns or even just like lessons of how to like get out of that normalization that happens in their communities? Like what would your message to current board members who as like you said, you know, the work for us was school because they get invited by the school. Yeah.
I mean, I would say there's strength in numbers. And, you know, I guess you are going to be required to, you know, have a little courage and, you know, be a little brave, and not be, scared. And, you know, just, you're not alone. If you're experiencing something, chances are somebody else is also experiencing it as well. So find a way to connect with others that are experiencing the same type of things and start building your numbers.
I would say as someone who lived, so I lived more in Ciudad Juarez than El Paso, and so I experienced a different type of pervasive violence. And it was jarring living in those places and then going to college elsewhere and realizing that things like, oh, not all of the communities are haphazardly gated because not everywhere there are murders on the street. And people freak out when they see helicopters with law enforcement signs on them because it's not normal to have helicopters
circling
above you at all times. I think part of what's tricky is that sometimes the best opportunities to realize that that is not normal come from a type of privilege that a lot of our people don't have, right? I was able to realize that in part because I got to leave El Paso and live elsewhere, and a lot of my family can't. And I think for those of us who have that opportunity and get to go back, a lot of times it's about meeting people where they're at. Because I think when I was fresh out of freshman year of college, I wanted to shake everyone and was like, why do we live like this? And it was like, because people are afraid. And because I happen to be a citizen and I have a lot less to risk than a lot of my other family members. And taking a moment to acknowledge that and meet people where they're at, and sometimes asking them questions, I think goes a long way for your people. And I think that just ties back to this idea of their strength in numbers, right? And so I think at times trying to work towards, building spaces where people can tell their stories. It's not a sweeping solution, but I think long-term, this kind of storytelling and this kind of safe spaces for storytelling are some of the best strategies we have.
Well, and also to kind of add to what you're saying, there's a lot of trauma in a lot of the communities, and that is something that is very difficult to overcome. You know, especially when you're wanting to change things. You know, again, that kind of plays into that fear and you know, that that fear of change one way or the other. Right? If you do something, there's going to be a consequence. It could be something positive or it could make things worse. And you know, many times we settle for what we know now because we're comfortable there, and we don't want to make things worse for ourselves.
I don't know when we're gonna get kicked out. We have time for one more question, and I had seen one over here, but maybe it's not amazing.
Well, I really want to thank you all. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Sorry.